Life in North Korea's most dangerous prison. A story of survival and witness. The barbed wire fence stretched endlessly across the frozen landscape, cutting through the mountains like veins through pale skin. Beyond it lay nothing but white, desolate snow that seemed to absorb all sound, all hope, all memory of what lay outside. This was Camp 14, though no one inside dared speak its name aloud. They called it simply the place, or home, words that had lost all meaning somewhere between the hunger and the cold. Min-jun had never known any other world. He was 34 years old, though his body looked 60. His face was gaunt, his teeth mostly gone, his hair long since turned gray from malnutrition and stress. He couldn't remember his mother's face anymore, but he remembered the taste of boiled bark that she had mixed with whatever grass they could find during the famine years. He remembered her hands, small and trembling, trying to warm him on winter nights when the temperature dropped so low that the very air seemed to crystallize. The prison camp was divided into zones. There was the agricultural sector, the manufacturing sector, and the political prisoner section hidden deeper within the compound. Min-jun worked in construction, maintaining the very structure of his own imprisonment. The guards enjoyed absolute power of life and death over the inmates. Some were cruel out of ideology. Others were simply broken men who had learned that exercising cruelty was the only way to climb the hierarchy. The rules were simple and absolute. Wake at dawn, work until exhausted, eat meager rations of corn porridge and watered broth, sleep on concrete floors, never speak except when ordered, never look a guard in the eye. Violation of these rules resulted in beatings or solitary confinement in the infamous isolation boxes, spaces so small that a prisoner could not stand. Min-jun had been beaten many times. The scars on his back formed a map of his years in the camp, but he had survived. This was both his greatest achievement and his deepest shame. The camp existed in permanent crisis. The regime claimed that conditions were improving, but the harvest was meager and the food never enough. Men died regularly, from starvation, disease, exhaustion, execution. There was no medical care. When men fell ill, they were moved to a separate section to die. The regime's propaganda was constant and inescapable. The speakers broadcast hourly about the glory of North Korea and the wisdom of the dear leader. Prisoners gathered each evening to attend ideological education sessions where they competed in demonstrating their devotion to the regime. Min-jun had learned to play this game. He had learned to nod at the right moments, to express the correct sentiments, to never allow his true thoughts to appear on his face. This performance was the difference between surviving and being selected for more brutal work details. The hierarchy within the prison was complex. There were informants, men the guards had turned, promising them extra food in exchange for reporting on their fellow prisoners. Min-jun had learned to be careful about who he spoke to. Yet there were also moments of genuine connection. An older man named Ho Seok had once given Min-jun a piece of his own meager ration when Min-jun was ill, asking for nothing in return. Ho Seok died 2 years later, caught trying to conceal a small amount of grain. The guards beat him severely and left him to die in isolation. The years accumulated like layers of sediment, each one pressing down harder than the last. One day during spring 2010, something changed in Min-jun's mind. He was working in the field, breaking soil with a dull tool. The guard was shouting about productivity. The other prisoners moved with mechanical efficiency. And Min-jun felt something inside him simply stop. It was as if the part of him fighting to stay alive had given up. He didn't want to die. He simply stopped caring whether he lived or died. He worked more slowly. He made mistakes. He allowed expressions to cross his face that weren't approved. He waited for punishment, but it didn't come. Or perhaps it did, and he simply didn't feel it anymore. A younger fellow named Tae-oh, who couldn't have been more than 20, began to watch him with understanding. "You're thinking about leaving," Tae-oh whispered one day when the guards were distracted. Min-jun didn't respond, but Tae-oh wasn't talking about escape. He was talking about the other kind of leaving. "I think about it too," Tae-oh said quietly. "I dream about it, about just not waking up tomorrow." "Don't," Min-jun heard himself say. His voice was hoarse from disuse. "Why not?" Teo asked. "What's left? We'll never leave this place alive. We'll work until we die, then they'll dig a hole and push us in. Maybe no one will even remember that we existed." Min-jun wanted to tell him he was wrong, but he couldn't. Teo wasn't wrong. 3 days later, Teo stopped eating his rations. The guards beat him severely, breaking his arm and several ribs, but he refused to eat. Within a week, he was gone, moved to the isolation section. Min-jun felt something shift in himself after Teo's decision. He had tried to save the young man and had failed. But then something unexpected happened. News filtered in slowly. Someone had heard a guard speaking. The regime was experiencing instability. There were rumors of division in the military and negotiations with the outside world. Discipline in the camp began to slip. The guards seemed distracted, worried about matters beyond the prison walls. Food somehow became slightly more available. Rumors circulated among the prisoners, whispers of camps being closed, whispers of amnesty programs, whispers of the regime making concessions to international pressure. Most were almost certainly false, but the mere existence of hope was intoxicating and dangerous. There was one rumor in particular. The regime was planning to release certain categories of prisoners, not all of them, but a small percentage. Those who had served long sentences, shown good behavior, or whose crimes were minor enough that they could be released without contradicting propaganda. Min-jun wasn't sure if he would qualify, but the possibility, once planted, began to grow. In spring 2013, an official from the regime came to inspect the camp. This was unusual. Officials rarely visited Camp 14 directly. For several days, conditions improved dramatically. The food was slightly better. The prisoners were cleaned up and presented for inspection. Everything was designed to demonstrate that the camp was running humanely. Min-jun realized what was happening. The regime was preparing to present the camp to international scrutiny, but the officials seemed genuinely shocked by what they saw. When they witnessed prisoners so malnourished they could barely stand, so beaten down that their eyes were empty of human expression, they seemed disturbed. One official asked about conditions. The guards hesitated, and that hesitation was enough. A prisoner named Sung Min spoke. "We are dying here. We are being starved and worked to death. This is not a prison. This is a tomb." The room went silent. The official's face showed shock, then something that might have been anger. "We will investigate this," he said through a translator. "Whoever is responsible will be held accountable." After the official left, the guards were merciless in retaliation. Sung Min was taken to isolation. His screams lasted for 2 days before stopping, but something had shifted. The regime could no longer pretend that these camps didn't exist or weren't the hell that prisoners knew them to be. Months passed. News filtered in. Changes were being made. Certain prisoners were being transferred to facilities with slightly better conditions, and even more remarkably, certain prisoners were being released. Min-jun did not allow himself to hope. Hope was dangerous. But hope came anyway, unbidden and unwelcome. He overheard a guard mentioning that more releases would happen. His heart began to race. He began to think about what he would do if released. Where would he go? He had no family that he knew of. He had no skills except construction. He had no money or documents. But even this bleak possibility seemed better than the certainty of death in the camp. And then one day, his name was called, not for punishment or reassignment, but for release. It happened almost without ceremony. They gave him worn clothes that didn't fit properly, a small amount of money, and a document identifying him as a released prisoner. Then they walked him to the gate. The guard at the gate looked at him with an expression hard to read. "Go," the guard said simply. "You are no longer needed here." Min-jun walked through the gate. Behind him, the barbed wire, the concrete building. Before him, the mountains and the road leading downward. He had spent 34 years in the camp. He had lost a third of his life there. He had lost his youth, health, family, and connection to normal society. He had forgotten how to laugh and dream. He had become a creature defined entirely by his ability to survive, and now, suddenly, there was no more surviving to do. The first city he came to was Chongjin. It was night when he arrived, and the streets were sparse. But even in darkness, the city seemed impossibly bright after the monotony of the camp. A shopkeeper, seeing a man in the ragged clothes of a released prisoner, offered him food. It was a simple meal of rice and soup, but it might as well have been a feast. His stomach, accustomed to minimal nutrition, protested at the abundance, and he found himself vomiting. "You've just come out," the shopkeeper said. It wasn't a question. "There are others like you," the shopkeeper said. "Released prisoners. Some have started trying to make a life outside the system. It's hard. The government watches them. Employers won't hire them, but it's possible. It's better than what you came from." Min-jun stayed in Chongjin for a week. The shopkeeper allowed him to sleep in a back room. During the day, he walked through the city, trying to reacquaint himself with how the world worked. It was overwhelming. There were people everywhere, engaged in activities that seemed random and purposeful at the same time. He felt like a ghost. One day, the shopkeeper gave him an address. "Go to this place in Pyongyang," he said. "It's run by a woman named Lee. She helps released prisoners adjust to life outside. It's not official. The government would shut it down if they knew about it. But Lee has connections. She might be able to help you." Getting to Pyongyang was an adventure in itself. Min-jun had to navigate the public transportation system, something he had no experience with. The bus journey took most of a day. He watched the landscape change. Mountains gave way to farmland. Farmland gave way to suburbs. And finally, Pyongyang appeared, the showcase of the regime. He found the address. It was a small apartment in an older building in a neighborhood the regime didn't prioritize. When the door opened, he found a woman in her 50s with knowing eyes. "Lee?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "You've come from outside?" It took Min-jun a moment to understand what she meant. Outside meant the camps. It was how released prisoners referred to their time in imprisonment. "Yes," he said, "from Camp 14. Lee's apartment was a hub for people like Min-jun. Lee had somehow maintained a network that helped people transition from the camps into society, even though this activity was technically illegal. "Why do you do this?" Min-jun asked her one evening. "Because I had a son," Lee said. "He was imprisoned in a camp. He died there. I never even knew which camp. And if I could do anything to prevent that from happening to other families, I would do it." Lee helped Min-jun find work at a construction company. The pay was meager, but it was consistent. More importantly, the work was not designed to break him. He could set it down at the end of the day and walk away. He rented a small room in a different part of the city. It was just a single space with a narrow bed, but it was his. He could lock the door. He could sleep without fear. He could eat what he wanted. Slowly, his body began to heal. The constant pain began to recede. He gained weight. His hair was cut short. He acquired new clothes that fit him. But the healing of his mind was slower, more complicated. He suffered from nightmares where he was back in the camp. He would wake in darkness, his heart racing, believing the sirens were calling him to work. He found it difficult to trust people. He had terrible habits formed in the camp, hoarding food, waking before dawn, treating every interaction with authority as a threat. Other released prisoners helped him understand that these were normal responses to abnormal trauma. There was another man named Dae-jung, who had been in a different camp for even longer than Min-jun. Dae-jung had been released 2 years earlier and was working as a porter at a hotel. The two men became friends. "We're like ghosts," Dae-jung said one evening in a park near Lee's apartment. "We exist between the camps and the normal world. We're not truly imprisoned anymore, but we're not truly free either." "Will it ever get better?" Min-jun asked. Dae-jung took a long time to answer. "Yes," he finally said. "It gets better. Not because memories go away or trauma heals completely, but because you realize you survived something most people can't survive. You're stronger than you think." Min-jun thought about Tae-oh, Hoseok, and Sung-min. "Do you think people need to know?" he asked. "About what happens in the camps?" "Yes," Dae-jung said. "They need to know, but they don't want to know. Knowing creates moral obligations." Min-jun began to write things down, small stories and recollections of life in the camp. At first, it was just for himself, a way of processing memories, but gradually he began to think these stories had value beyond his own healing. About 18 months after his release, a woman came to Lee's apartment seeking help. Her name was Hai-won, and she was a journalist from an international news organization working undercover in North Korea. She had connections with defectors who had escaped the camps. She was trying to gather testimonies from people who had experienced imprisonment. It was incredibly dangerous work. If she was caught, she would be imprisoned. If the people she was interviewing were discovered, they would be returned to the camps or executed. Min-jun was terrified at first. Writing down his experiences was one thing. Telling them to a journalist who would potentially publish them to the world was another. It was dangerous. It could result in his re-imprisonment or worse. But Lee encouraged him. "These stories need to be told," she said. "If you don't tell them, who will?" Dae-jung said something similar. "This is the purpose. This is why we survived, so that we could tell the world what happened." Min-jun agreed. Over several weeks, Haiwan conducted interviews with him, recording his experiences. She asked difficult questions, pushing him to remember things he had tried to forget. She documented the scars on his back. When the interviews were complete, Haiwan told him she would be leaving the country. His testimony, along with others, would be compiled into a report for the international community. "Will it make a difference?" Min-jun asked. "I don't know," Haiwan said honestly. "But each additional testimony makes it harder for the regime to deny reality. Each voice adds weight to the evidence." Years passed. Min-jun continued working in construction. His body began to fail in small ways. His back hurt constantly. His lungs were permanently damaged. But he was alive. He was free, even if the psychological chains would never fully leave. He learned to read better. He learned about the world beyond North Korea through illegal radio broadcasts and smuggled books. He learned that his testimony had been compiled into reports distributed internationally. He learned that organizations were working to expose the camps and pressure the regime to close them. When Min-jun was 45, something remarkable happened. Lee came to him with news. The international reports, combined with other geopolitical pressures, had led to a negotiation. The regime was agreeing to close Camp 14 and allow international observers to inspect the facilities. It wasn't an admission of guilt. It was simply a calculated decision that maintaining the camp was no longer advantageous. Min-jun felt tears streaming down his face. Not because the camps were closed. Other camps remained operational, but because something had changed. The darkness had been exposed to the light. He thought of Tai-o, Ho-seok, and all the people who had died in the camps. Perhaps their deaths had acquired meaning. Perhaps they had not suffered in vain. By the time Min-jun reached his late 40s, the world had changed. The regime was experiencing increasing international pressure. Sanctions, accusations of crimes against humanity, calls for an international tribunal. Min-jun was invited to testify in a hypothetical hearing, a mock tribunal held by international observers to document the regime's crimes. He traveled for the first time beyond North Korea's borders, crossing into South Korea with a forged document. The experience was overwhelming. The differences were staggering. He testified for 2 days about his experiences, answering questions about conditions, punishments, and the system of control. And then, during a recess, a woman approached him. She was in her 40s and bore a faint resemblance to him. "Min-jun?" she asked tentatively. "My name is Min-ah," the woman said. "I'm your sister." Min-jun's sister had been released from the camp system before he was born. She had been imprisoned with their parents, but was selected for release as a teenager, given a new identity, and resettled in a remote area. Her whole life had been hiding her past. The reunion was overwhelming. Min-ah wept as she listened to her brother's testimony. Min-jun learned that his parents had died in the camp long ago. His father executed in 1992 for attempting to escape. His mother died of disease and malnutrition in 1998. They spent a week together, reacquainting themselves. Min-ah had escaped North Korea and now lived in South Korea with her own family, a husband and 2 children born into freedom. "Come to South Korea," Min-ah urged. "You can start a new life." Min-jun was tempted, but he hesitated. "I need to go back," he told his sister. "There are still people there. People like Lee and Dae-jung. I can't abandon them." Min-jun returned to North Korea with new connections. International observers had established a presence. He worked with delegations, helping to facilitate interviews with other released prisoners. He became a bridge between the international community and those still suffering. Years continued to pass. He was now in his 50s. His health was declining. He had never married, never had children. The experiences had left him emotionally unable to form intimate bonds. But he had found meaning in his work, purpose in bearing witness. Then one day, news came that shook the world. The regime had collapsed. It happened gradually at first. Defections, economic crisis, internal divisions. Then, suddenly, it was over. In the aftermath, investigations began. International teams moved through the country, documenting crimes, preserving evidence. Min Jun was asked to serve as a guide, helping investigators understand Camp 14's layout and the systems of control. It was painful work returning to that place, but it was also liberating. The camp was no longer imprisonment. It was a crime scene. As he walked through the compound with investigators, pointing out buildings where torture occurred, he felt something shift. The power the camp had held began to dissipate. He had survived, and his survival had contributed to the exposure of the regime's crimes. Meaning had been forged from suffering. In 2025, the International Criminal Court established a tribunal to prosecute the high-level officials responsible for the camp system. Min Jun testified for 3 days about his experiences: systematic starvation, arbitrary punishments, dehumanization. He saw his former guards in the courtroom, now elderly men in suits. Some looked remorseful, some looked defiant, some looked confused. When asked why he had survived while so many others died, Min Jun paused. "Luck," he said finally, "and perhaps the will to bear witness. I survived so that I could tell the world what happened here. If I had died, these crimes might have remained hidden forever. My survival served a purpose beyond myself." The tribunal continued for months. A verdict was reached. The high-level officials were found guilty of crimes against humanity, including torture, starvation, and extrajudicial execution. By his early 60s, North Korea was transforming. Democratic institutions were being established. The economy was opening. The camps had been officially closed. Camp 14 was being converted into a museum dedicated to documenting the regime's crimes. Min Jun had become a historical figure. He was invited to give lectures and presentations. His testimony had been translated into multiple languages and was studied in universities and human rights organizations. But the most important validation came from families of the dead. Many had been denied information about what happened to their loved ones. Testimonies from survivors like Min Jun helped provide closure. He received letters from people whose relatives had died in the camp. He consulted with researchers creating comprehensive records. He helped identify individuals in photographs. In his late 60s, Min Jun decided to step back from public life. He was tired. His body was failing. He returned to Pyongyang, where Lee was still living. She was in her 80s, still mentally sharp and still helping people. Min Jun and Lee lived together in the apartment that had been his refuge decades before. They spent their days quietly, talking about the past. "Do you think it was worth it?" Lee asked him one day. "All of this suffering, all of these years. Do you think the world has changed because we bore witness?" Min Jun took a long time to answer. "I think the world is always changing, sometimes in good directions, sometimes in bad ones. We can't control whether change goes in the direction we hope for, but by bearing witness, by refusing to allow the suffering to be forgotten, we ensure that if change comes, it comes with an understanding of what was done. That has to mean something." Min Jun spent his final years in quiet reflection. He wrote a book, not dramatic or a call to action, but a detailed, unflinching description of what life in the camp had been like. It was published in multiple languages and became required reading in schools and universities. He received visitors, people who wanted to thank him, who wanted to hear his story, who were studying history. But mostly, he spent time with Lee, watching the seasons change. In 2031, at 75, Min Jun fell ill. His damaged lungs and weakened body could no longer sustain life. He spent his final days in a hospital in Pyongyang, surrounded by friends and his sister Mina, who had traveled from South Korea. As he lay dying, he reflected on his life. He had survived 34 years in a prison designed to destroy body and spirit. He had emerged broken, but not destroyed. He had devoted the rest of his life to ensuring that what happened would be remembered. His final words were simple: "I lived. I bore witness. That was enough. After Min Jun's death, his legacy continued. His book remained in print. His testimony was preserved in digital archives. The tribunal that convicted the regime's leaders was the beginning of justice. Other survivors came forward. Other perpetrators were identified and held accountable. The camp system was recognized as one of the worst crimes against humanity. Camp 14 became a museum and historical site. Visitors could walk through and understand what had happened. Plaques honored those who had suffered and died. Min Jun's name was among them. In universities worldwide, students studied his case. His life became a meditation on suffering, survival, and meaning after trauma. Some argued justice had never truly been served, that punishment could never compensate for millions suffering. This was true, but others argued the very existence of the tribunal, the documentation and acknowledgement of crimes, represented a fundamental shift in how the world understood its responsibility to protect people from atrocities. Min Jun would never know if his life made an ultimate difference, if his testimony prevented future atrocities, if memories would prevent similar systems elsewhere. These were questions with no answers. But this was certain. He had lived. He had survived an ordeal designed to destroy him. He had emerged and devoted himself to ensuring the suffering meant something. He had borne witness. He had created a record the world could not ignore. He had transformed his suffering into meaning, his trauma into a tool for justice, his broken life into a testament to human resilience and the power of bearing witness. That was enough.